So here to introduce this topic and the panelists, I think it's going to be Raychelle or Malinda. Which one of you is going to do it? Raychelle?
I'm going to start, yeah.
So Raychelle Daniel. Raychelle's with the Pew Trust for the Environment, and she's also on the Science Steering Committee for Search, and she has a million other things she does. And she and several of the people here on this panel have led the effort to really involve Indigenous people in this meeting in a meaningful way. Raychelle?
Great, thank you. So Malinda and I are co-facilitating, but we'd like the Indigenous Peoples Working Group to stand up to be recognized because this panel was very collaborative and it's been a group effort. So please, Corey, Nikush, Julie, please, all of you folks stand up and be recognized. And so before we move on, we would also like to thank Maya Lucan in the last panel, for talking about tragedies and how tragedies impact our lives and how we can relate to them. And we'd like to also take a moment just to acknowledge and to have in our thoughts the folks in the Bahamas who are experiencing a tragedy born out of their environment, and now they're dealing with the aftermath of that tragedy. And so as Indigenous peoples, we relate to the environment and we face these tragedies all the time. And so we just wanted to take that recognition before we start. And so the other thing, some of the challenges that, we faced in bringing this panel together, reflect the challenges that as Indigenous peoples, we face, in our daily lives. And one of the panelists experienced weather delays, fog in Savoonga. And that's representative of our transportation and weather-related challenges we increasingly face. Another panelist responded to the loss of one of our young regional leaders. And so as Indigenous peoples, working in the forefront of all these issues on these different fronts, we face many critical issues, but we also have to decide on where we put our time and our effort. And we have to make choices, and we really support the choice, of Charlene Stern to be with her region and her family. And so, regarding family, I think it's really important to all of us as Indigenous peoples, and we all engage our family in these issues. And so, we'd like to share that that Deenaalee, one of our panelists, is also the daughter of Malinda, one of our co-facilitators. And Indigenous Working Group also felt the importance of having the youth voice. And so this panel, building off from what Daly said yesterday, Daly talked about our worldview. What's our worldview? And we're a part of the ecosystem. We see ourselves that way. And she also talked about co-production of knowledge and bringing equitably Indigenous worldviews and science or policy together. And so our panel here is going to help inform by their experiences, what does that equity look like and how do we build that equity? And so please see their full biographies in your handout. But really briefly, I'm just gonna say a sentence or two about everybody because they're wonderful people. So George Noongwook is St. Lawrence Island Yupik, Indigenous knowledge holder, and he'll share, what's Indigenous knowledge mean as a St. Lawrence Island Yupik. Austin Ahmasuk is from Nome and will share his experiences working in policy and trying to bring regional perspectives to the federal level and international level. And then Deenaalee Hodgdon spent last spring semester as an intern at the Wilson Center Polar Initiative, and then commercial fishing in Bristol Bay. And so she's gonna, share her vision. What's 2050 look like for, a young Indigenous person strongly grounded in her culture? And so George is going to start off. So George, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here so I can be able to tell a few stories about why we do things the way we do. And from time immemorial, several millennia back. But our activities, on subsistence fishing, subsistence hunting, gathering, is all based on knowledge that was given to you by your forefathers. And I think most importantly, the location of where you conduct your subsistence hunt and gather food is based on that information and how it can save you time and energy, because without those, you won't have much energy left trying to get to your subsistence activities. But St. Lawrence Island happens to be in a location where marine mammals migrate en masse. I mean, this is the corridor, the Bering Strait, Chukchi Sea, and the Beaufort Sea contains the world's richest marine mammal migration ever in the whole world. So we're really fortunate to have been located within that area, so we can spend less time, less energy to obtain what you need to feed your whole community. Not only that, it helps you to get along with people. It helps you to observe and protect what you have. You want to be able to do that because you have grandchildren and children that you really love. And to do that, you must be able to protect that realm so they can enjoy the same pride, same energy, same food that we're experiencing right now. So it does provide, culturally, nutritionally, it's economic, spiritual benefits to all of our people, this activity. And if you look at the history of where the settlements around St. Lawrence Island are, all those settlements are within a few. They don't have to go very far to get the food. They don't have to expend as much energy to obtain the food. So it gives them the benefits, that added benefits to be able to cooperate and share. The cooperating and sharing of your resources is the key to our survival, has been the key to our survival all this millennia. So if we continue doing that, your children and grandchildren is going to be able to have the same benefits and experience that you're having right now. And even with all the changes that are happening within our regions, we always look for opportunities. We get to the high points. We have men looking every day, pretty much looking for opportunities. And from that opportunities, from that observations, we've been able to adapt to changes that are happening. Some of them are negative, but for example, we were able to create a new whaling season based on the changes in observation. And that is the winter whaling season. And by far, I think maybe through history, our activities in whaling were conducted in springtime. But now it's shifted to winter. It was the last 2 years, 2016, 2017, we didn't see any ice in St. Lawrence Island for 2 years. In the spring, summer, fall, winter, there was no ice. But even with that, without the ice, we were able to provide nutrition, provide spiritual health, provide that realm based on observations, based on adaptation to what you have, because without that observation, without the cooperation and sharing and knowledge that it's happening even with those changes, you are practicing a way for your children and grandchildren to adapt to changes. So those are very important. I think maybe even down the road, I think we'll be able to see how important everything is interconnected. You'll be able to see the stars, to see the whole ecosystem, how it's all interconnected. And the most important one is the oceans. We call the oceans imak. Imak means contents. Everything the ocean provides, nutrition to lots of people. 50% of American citizens eat seafood from the Bering Strait, Bering Sea. So all of you should be able to think about doing our part to protect that realm of ocean, because it provides not only to us, but everybody in this world. If we can practice not to pollute it, practice not to take care of it, don't trash it. I think maybe we can go a long way, because the way things are going, sea level is rising, and the ocean's going to take you away if you don't take care of it. So, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, George. And Austin?
Well, thank you. Good morning. I'm very happy to be here. And good morning to folks back in Alaska who are maybe listening in at the 6 o'clock hour. I work for Kawerak in their marine program. In 2014, Kawerak established the marine program to address some very severe issues related to increased shipping, to address some very severe issues related to climate change. And the marine program started off very quickly with workshops in the region to understand and collaborate with the U.S. Coast Guard, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, NOAA, NIMS, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as many federal and state agencies as we possibly could to address what we considered and what we do consider some very severe impacts that we've already seen, that we've already experienced from increased shipping. Over the first couple years that the program existed, we made some findings, and we made some very strong policy stances on shipping. If you want to know more about what the Kawerak Marine Program has been doing related to shipping, of course, you can go to our website, kawerak.org. You can search, Google search Kawerak Marine Program, and it should bring you straight to our Marine Program webpage. There we have our policy letters, our comments, our concerns, our various reports that we've done over those first couple years that the Marine Program existed. And I urge you to look those up or contact me. In those first couple years, what we found was that communities were very concerned about impacts to communities, how communities are changing because of shipping, how communities are very concerned about impacts to marine mammals, the marine environment from shipping. And then another aspect, a third aspect that we found early on and that we're still working on is the nature of discharge from shipping, whether it's gray water, black water, sewage, oily wastes, and very importantly for our region, the potential for oil spills as a result of increased shipping. In our region, we are not very well prepared for impacts of vessel discharge. Less than half of our communities have any kind of significant oil spill response equipment. Essentially, Nome and Unalakleet have skimmers, have suckers. The rest of the communities that do have something, the few the handful essentially just have absorbent pads. A couple years into the program, in 2016, it became really evident how shipping is changing. In August 2016, the Crystal Serenity visited our region. And up to that point, I had been involved in tabletop exercise as well as communications related to that first voyage of a very large cruise ship to our region. And during the tabletop exercise and during the ramp up to its arrival, we were told that it would be escorted by an escort vessel, the Ernest Shackleton. And so in August 2016, it was a foggy day. I drove to the port and watched it come over the horizon, and I was very concerned and very interested as to where the Shackleton was, the escort vessel, which we were told would be accompanying the Crystal Serenity. I never saw it. It was foggy, and I thought, oh, maybe it stayed offshore. So I went back to the office to look and see where the escort vessel was. It was on the other side of the globe in the Canadian archipelago. So the concerns that we have related to preparedness, the concerns that we have about vessels, we think that they're serious. We think that they're real, and we're trying to engage. We are engaging in manners that involve local advocacy, statewide advocacy, national advocacy, and international advocacy. So my job takes me throughout the world. Fortunately, my colleagues in region have also been at the table of advocacy, we call it, locally, nationally, and internationally. But it is very difficult. Dealing with international organizations on the issue of shipping is extremely complex. Vessels, the issue of vessels involves many aspects, from one part of the horizon to the other part of the horizon. Vessel paint, vessel propellers, vessel discharge, the 40 or so sources of discharge that vessels have. These extraordinarily complex issues. Lately, over the last couple years, the Marine program has been working to try to implement some of the ideas that have come from our workshops, namely the carriage and usage of heavy fuel oil, which we addressed in partnership with ENGOs internationally to seek the ban of heavy fuel oil in the Arctic, the usage of heavy fuel oil in the Arctic. Also lately addressing issues of gray water, black water, and sewage discharge in the Arctic. And as Melanie mentioned yesterday, some advocacy on navigation, which we worked pretty heavily with and very hard on with the U.S. Coast Guard Port Access Route Study, as well as the International Maritime Port Access Route Study, and those areas to be avoided. In the next several years, in the future, the region is looking towards establishing itself in the realm of shipping. In the last year, Kawerak withdrew from the Arctic Waterways Safety Committee. We want a much stronger role, a much more direct role in how shipping is managed in our region. We take to heart the words that are said about our community from politicians who say they want to see and they want to ensure that local concerns are heard, local communities are heard, and their views are expressed. We in our region we do believe that we need to be able to put a barrier at the Bering Strait. Our ancestral waters, our waters are ours, as George mentioned. We're very concerned about what's happening to our region. If the politicians, truly believe in local community and local involvement, then that should be part of the discussion. Maybe we can't get there, but it should at least be part of the contrasting voices that are heard in Washington, D.C. about shipping in the Arctic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Deenaalee Hodgdon. I want to start out today by talking about and acknowledging the Nakotchunk and Piscataway people in which Washington, D.C. land was taken from, and also acknowledging the African American people that built the foundations of Washington, D.C. I'm a commercial fisherwoman in Bristol Bay, Alaska. I commercial fish in order to, one, have a relationship with the fish in our area, as well as to bring home money so that I can survive in a mixed economy in which I have to be paying for school, and I also have to be contributing to, fuel in the wintertime and other ways of living an Arctic life. As a commercial fisherwoman this summer, I was able to witness, and unfortunately had to witness, fish die off in our waters. The temperatures in Bristol Bay exceeded 68 degrees on some days in the water. I saw ghost fish in drifts. I saw them come up over our reel, and it was not because of the excess amount of drift gill netters out in our waters. It was because of increased temperatures of the ocean. I also, while I was out there, was reflecting on what it meant to be a commercial fisherwoman, and what it means to have to live within this mixed economy. And what I realized as I saw ghost fish drift by was that I want to be set netting. I want a balanced lifestyle. I want a lifestyle where I can be picking fish and earning an income and having that relationship with this animal at the same time that I can go out onto the tundra and pick berries, because I miss the best salmon berry picking year that we have seen in 5-10 years. Oh, thank you. Hello? Is that better? I want this balanced lifestyle because this is the lifestyle that my ancestors have been able to live up until 1492 and beyond. I want this lifestyle because this is what it means to be Indigenous. It's what it means to be an Indigenous woman. I want to be able to fillet fish, and I want to be able to pick berries. I want to be able to tan moose hides, and I want to be able to go out hunting for caribou. Oftentimes, I'm not able to go out hunting, mostly because I'm here finishing my education at Brown University, where I study anthropology and public policy. As we look towards co-production, whether it's co-production in the sciences or it's co-production across policy making and decision making, I don't just want a seat at the table. I want our young people to be the Indigenous scientists. I want our young people to be the Indigenous policymakers. I want us at the table with our voices heard, acknowledged, and there. And I want us to be able to stand up and speak our truth without fear of being looked down on, without fear of continued colonization, because yes, we still live in a colonized world. Alaska, right now in Bristol Bay, we are facing Pebble Mine and the implications of what Pebble Mine will do to our salmon resources. And right now, as we look towards the future and as we make policies as scientists and as people and as citizens, we must look towards a future that has green energy and not green colonialism, as we were talking about yesterday. We must look at it through an equitable lens. And what does equity look like? It means equality and the opportunity for all peoples to have a future. As we look towards co-production, what does that mean, and why must we have it? Why must an Indigenous voice be at the table? An Indigenous voice must be at the table because we know what it means to live in relation and see ourselves as a part, not as the top of that hierarchy, but as a part of the ecosystems that we are trying to save, that we are trying to manage, that we are trying to coexist with. So as we step into the future, I want us, and I expect that seat at the table. And I think as a young person, and as looking towards Arctic Futures 2050, I don't know if I'm going to be able to, or if my grandchildren will be able to fillet fish. I don't know at this point if we will have a good berry year. Every single season, to me right now, is important. And because of that, I think we need to be able to imagine those futures. And part of imagining those futures is having us here, right now, and having you actually listen, and having people dig deep down and be able to unsettle what it means to live in a capitalist society, and what it means to live in a society that has been built on resource extraction. Dogden.
Well, we certainly are privileged to have this range of voices that represent us as people. You can see there are a wide range of voices. They represent Alaska, they represent the Arctic, and as many of you are here to have conversations with us, know that these conversations may not be easy. They may be tough. They may be a space where we expand on our history, because we also know that there's many of you that need to hear our history. It's not an easy place to be as you hear the voice of our youth say what is in our future, and look at these big complex proposals like Pebble Mine that we are looking at in the biggest wild salmon arena in the world. And then you have our elder who is challenging us to look at the choices we're making individually and how do we take care of our oceans. So to that end, I want to ask George, because you have, I just want to say, I'm going to ask this question because we have a few questions that our Indigenous group asked us to start off with, and then we'll move into the questions from the audience. So George, you talked about our reciprocal relationship with the land, and particularly with the ocean. And then can you speak more about what kind of information and solutions that need to move both ways between us as Indigenous people and the science, and in addition, the policymakers? Do you need me to expand more? Did you hear me, George? Oh, I'm sorry. Can you, I don't know if this is working, can you talk more about the reciprocal relationship, or how we need to share, what kind of information and solutions we need to be moving between or among policymakers and our Indigenous people and scientists?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm really hard of hearing, so you have to yell at me sometimes with your grandkill. But interrelationship, interconnection has to do with being able to work together. So I think maybe when you practice that realm, I think maybe you're going to be a lot better off in terms of survival, in terms of providing sustenance, in terms of providing the living, your living being, being able to be happy, being able to interrelate with your kids and grandkids. I think maybe that's the most important thing that all of us do in this world, is to take care. And to be able to take care of each other in that sense, I think maybe it allows people to work together and to cooperate willingly and freely. So it's a really important aspect to be able to obtain that relationship by working together and give that reciprocity. I think maybe you being able to, if you do that, you're going to get gifts from other members of your community. So in that sense, I think maybe it's sharing of these important resources, be able to get along with people. I think maybe it's the key to be happy, to obtain that feeling of accomplishment feeling of being able to be socially responsible. I think maybe those aspects are really important if you want to continue living a life that is most pleasing to you. I think maybe that's the most important thing.
Thank you, George. And my question, moving from our elder, I'm going to go to our youth. And this question's for Deenaalee because you spoke so passionately about needing that seat at the table. And I also wanted to acknowledge a comment from the audience, from Daryl John from Guigalngok, Alaska, that speaks also towards your passion. And he states that there's a difference in rural policy and urban policy, that rural policy will not work in urban areas, and urban policy will not work in rural areas. Tribal community leaders need to be involved when it comes to developing rural policies. And so my question for you, Deenaalee, is, having the capacity, to engage in research or policy processes, and having the ability at a young age to be able to engage in those processes. Many youth from Western-based communities have a jump start in going to university and being able to participate in conferences like this as students and giving posters and talks. And so what support do you need to bring that Indigenous youth voice, to be able to participate in these, Western processes? And what might our institutions look like so that there is a seat at the table?
I think first and foremost, I think you need to go to the youth, and we will not know the opportunities that we have available until we are able to see the opportunities and experience the opportunities as well. I think that's kind of the catch-22 of being a youth or a marginalized person in this country, is that we don't know those opportunities until they are presented to us. And then when they are presented, we might have a voice and we might not be able to necessarily say what we need to say when we are brought into spaces like this. So one, I want to say, Dogaden, thank you very much for allowing me to speak today, because like we acknowledged, there aren't a lot of youth here, and are they on this stage? Maybe not. Which is a tough conversation that, again, we also need to be engaging in. I had the opportunity of coming to Washington, D.C. last semester through my university, and I will say that I would not be able to go to a university on the East Coast without having a full scholarship, which I am very, very grateful for. And yet that opportunity was presented to me because I was able to take a risk in high school and apply to an institution on the East Coast. I think when we are brought, it's a difficult question. And when we're brought into these spaces, I guess what I want to say is, how do you become a mentor? How do you become a mentor across cultures? How do you become a mentor across continents? And I think part of that is, one, as a mentor, if you are from the East Coast or you're from Washington, D.C., it's learning about that young person's home area, not just from that young person, but doing your own research as well. Being able to engage in conversation with them, and I say with them because it's not always to them. It's being able to bring that young person to the table and say, what are your ideas on this? What experiences that you have, and not just Western academic experiences, not just high school social studies, not just high school biology. What is your experience on the land? And also realizing that when our young people hold our silence, or we are quiet, or we might not necessarily engage in a space like this, that is okay. We have to be able to consent to sharing our knowledge as well. And when we hold back, and when we decide to raise our voice, then it's time to listen. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Deenaalee. Dogadan. I want to wrap one of our questions in part with also a question from the working group. So this is for Austin. And part of this is a comment. So the value of Indigenous and traditional knowledge needs to be elevated. This knowledge is real life and not an educated guess. And so what can we do to accomplish this? And then you are in a particularly significant role for your region and for Alaska, I would say. And so with this, expanding on that, what steps do we need, like on the part of Congress or the federal government, to equitably include Indigenous knowledge in the processes, in their processes?
Well, if you would have asked me 5 years ago if the Bering Strait would be ice-free in February, I would have said no way. For the last 2 years, it's been totally ice-free. In February, in the deepest part of winter, it's been ice-free. For that question, I think I'll concentrate on Congress. And there's a quote from Bertrand Russell. I might not get this right, but it's a healthy thing, he says, to hang a question mark on those things that we've taken for granted. A very eloquent way of just saying, question authority, question power, question what you know, right? In Congress, what I've seen over the last several years, if you've paid attention to U.S. Senate committee hearings or U.S. House committee hearings, there are two things that I've been very frustrated with. And that is, number one, this sort of a fallacy or false dilemma that congressmen get into when they're discussing the Arctic, when they're discussing climate change. Questions during those committee meetings are often couched in a yes-no form. Answer the question on climate change in a yes-no fashion. Answer the question on shipping and military strategy in a yes-no format. Even if it might seem like the obvious question is yes or no, I don't think that that's the case. We don't live in a binary world. There are more complexities to the questions that are happening in the Arctic, the things that are happening in the Arctic. The other thing that I'll mention on that is the rhetoric that is indicated with our politicians, and that is national interests in the Arctic, exercising national interest in the Arctic. And for that, I'll give a really small history lesson, history reference, we'll say. In the late 1800s, the U.S. Revenue Cutter Service, which is the precursor to the Coast Guard, commissioned a couple folks, Captain Healy and Captain Merriman, into Alaska. And in the late 1800s, Captain Healy and Captain Merriman bombed the native village of Angoon, destroyed the village of Angoon for what I consider a rather unfortunate miscommunication. Some years later, Captain Healy was dispatched to the northern Alaska to ensure the national interests in the Arctic region. When Healy came to my ancestors' hometown, Wales, and I'm going to plug another reference here, the book The Ice Windows, if you haven't read, which is a series of letters from teachers at that time from Wales to their family in the south. When Healy came to my region of Alaska, the native people there, my ancestors, replaced their faith in God with the fear of Captain Healy and his guns. When the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Healy visits our region every year, which it does a couple times a year, for me it's a very unpleasant reminder of how the U.S. is exercising its national interest in the Arctic. Now, we are not being directly threatened anymore, but we as Native people, we are replacing certain things about our traditional way of life with other things. And in this day and age of national interests, whether they are military, corporate, industry, development, science and research, for us, it generally means destruction. destruction of longstanding traditions, destruction of longstanding history, and destruction of longstanding places. So I would like the steps to be that Congress engage in a little bit of questioning of themselves, questioning if things are right, questioning if this path is the correct one, and not engaging in a very bipartisan political discussion.
You're not off the hook yet. So. I've got a second part of that. And part of that is we have a mixed group here with our own people here. So to that end, what steps do we need on the part of Indigenous knowledge holders to equitably include Indigenous knowledge at those tables? So what's our responsibility? And so we've seen some of it demonstrated here, but can you expand on that?
Well, I think our responsibility is to demand resilience and adaptation on our own terms. We often hear in political discussions this idea that we are resilient, we are adaptable, but I think that what we need to do is demand resilience and adaptation on our own terms. A very good example of how that is, well, not taking place, but a good example of how we are really trying is with the BLM Resource Management Plan, the Bering Sea Western Interior Resource Management Plan that is now under consideration, a long multi-year process that began with scoping in 2015, 2016 for a period of a couple of years. And then this last year and a half, the unveiling of a very dramatic change in how Bering Sea Western Interior lands are going to be managed for the next 20 years. And during scoping, people in communities said very clear things about how their land should be managed, that they shouldn't be mined, that there should be areas of critical and environmental concern considered. But what happened in the BLM process was that scoping did not reflect the plan. Right? So had some sort of process been in place in the beginning that better captured scoping, had there been a process in place for tribes to have really expansive capacity, really powerful capacity to make change during scoping or during other resource management plans or during other federal actions, right? There may have been an opportunity to implement an idea from our region. The problem that we face in rural Alaska, and for folks like myself, is that we generate lots of ideas. We know what's right for us. We know what's right for us. Our many, many thousands of years of living where we have generates wisdom. Wisdom. We know what's right. So there has to be a way of implementing that. And it has to be primarily not what we do, because as Maya said earlier, we're doing it. Our voice is on the table. The other side's not listening.
So part of what I hear today is the collective responsibility that we have. We are showing up, and then how are we being responded to, and then pushing those spaces. Listening to your comment there, or your story there about the Healy. Yesterday I heard another story by somebody here based in DC that talked about being on the Healy recently, and they were going through our waters there in Alaska, and I asked, well, did you have an Indigenous voice on the ship? No Indigenous voice, right? So that's a clear example of a great opportunity for scientists to be on that, for other folks to be on that, but the opportunity missed for not having our voice on that. And then what's the structure that needs to be in place? Because clearly you saw that type of knowledge that's held here, and you can see in these photos that could be expanded upon in that kind of space. And so I think thinking about those things and hearing the comments that were shared here today about how do you expand that space and what is reciprocity. I am fortunate enough to also have been involved in some of the regulatory process through another hat that I wear. And I think that's a process that is a very challenging process for our folks, but it's also a place that science is being used. And so when we're thinking about the reciprocity of our relationship in terms of both opening up our communities and working with the science community and working with policy, then at the same time there are concepts that can be shared with our community, like in understanding and expanding the concept of best available science. What does that mean? Because you see in these three people represented here that we are not only having to learn and understand the governance processes that are in place, that are not our own traditional government processes, but we have to show up and we have to also use the data to advocate. So we run the gamut. We're not just dealing with scientists, we're having to advocate and push the dial on things. And so understanding like what is the best available science that goes into some of these documents and what that concept means for our people, so that when we run into these regulatory process that doesn't have the most current science, which many of the EISs currently don't have the most recent science, that we know we can question that. Oh, we can question this science. So I just wanted to expand on those two because those two are examples that recently came out of some of these discussions. So are we about out of time? Okay.
Yeah, it looks like it, but before we hand the mic back over and we're pulled off the stage, we would like to invite all the Indigenous participants to join us for lunch today so that we can build on these conversations and see where we need to go from here. And we're going to meet in the members' room, so please join us for lunch there. And we just wanted to thank all the panelists. Thank you very much, Goyana, Jakna, for coming.